Hi, everyone, and welcome all to another episode of ThatOneSecGuy's podcast. Friends, as many of you know, supply chain security is a complex and ever evolving field. In essence, it is about protecting our critical infrastructure and data throughout the entire product life cycle. But with so many players involved in the entire supply chain, vulnerabilities from a security standpoint can emerge at any point. And to discuss this, I am very excited to have Akash Ravi here today to delve deeper into this crucial topic. Uh, Talking about Akash, he is a guy who's dabbled in quite a few stuff. And in the early stages of our careers team, let me tell you, Akash and I were involved in the development of a threat intelligence platform. And as someone who has worked alongside of Akash, let me tell you that this guy always has some new learnings to offer. So I'm very excited to have you on the show, Akash, and thank you for doing this nonetheless on the weekend.
Thanks a lot, Harshil. It's my pleasure to be here and as a consequence, connect with the audience. Happy to share my thoughts and learnings. So, looking
Awesome.
forward to it.
So let's start, Akash. We are going to be starting right from the fundamentals, right? So we'll get started with what are the fundamentals of supply chain security. And for our listeners who might be new to the topic, can you explain what supply chain security is all about and why it's become such a critical issue in today's interconnected world?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when you think of a supply chain, you could just call it the thing that enables creation to delivery. So, in the context of a supply chain, it involves every aspect that includes people, processes, and the technology right from the moment where someone ideates a solution
Mm-hmm.
to the process where they build it to the process where they get it deployed and finally getting it distributed to its intended audience. Everything that goes into making this process happen, all the tools, technology, the code, the the systems that make this delivery possible, that's all a part of the software supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
And as it might seem evident, there's like a lot of moving parts to it, and cybersecurity is like essential in each of those parts. So
Okay.
ensuring that you have like this holistic approach to securing your end-to-end supply chain for creating software is
Mm.
what is termed as software supply chain security.
Okay. Okay. And I think it has become more relevant today or in this era more than it was maybe 5, 6 years back or last decade back, right? And I think this is owing to the fact that beyond the usual suspects, we are seeing new players emerge in the cyber threat landscape as well. So, Akash, with the rise of activist collectives and even state-sponsored actors that are rising, how do you see the landscape of supply chain attacks evolving, and what sort of unique challenges do these pose?
Oh, that's an amazing question. So, this software supply chain has always existed ever since the beginning of the times when we started creating software because everything
Hmm.
had to go through supply chain. So, if you look at our domain, the computer science domain in general, we work on abstractions, like
Yes.
right from the hardware, creating software, everything is built on top of an abstraction because that's how our discipline works.
Yes.
When writing a software, you don't need to know how it compiles to your assembly code. You don't need to know how it runs on the physical silicon and all that.
Hmm.
So this in itself is a supply chain, but the reason why this topic has become really important in recent days is because of how this entire process happens.
Hmm.
So maybe a decade ago, or I should say until a decade ago, software was usually shipped on a waterfall basis. People used to
Yes.
write software, and the primary means of distribution for software was to through persistent media like CD drives, or you would create an executable, put it on a website for people to download onto their systems, have them
Correct.
use it, and just like the primary means of distribution.
Hmm.
But then in the last decade, with the advancements that we've had in cloud computing, a lot
Hmm.
of these processes have become really agile. there's this notion of continuous integration, continuous delivery.
Mm,
People make sure that the time between ideation to delivery is minimized as much as possible. So,
mm,
the moment something is ideated, the people writing code, and
yeah,
as they check in code, this entire discipline of DevOps that ensures that, the moment a code is checked in, it becomes available to the end users as quickly as possible.
right.
So, as you make this process more agile, more rapid, and you try to shorten things down,
Mm,
the aspect of cybersecurity also becomes really important because now you have much less time to validate, you have much less time to react, and you'll have to be proactive in everything that you do.
right.
So I think that's the reason why software supply chain security has become quite important in the recent days. That's
Mm-hmm.
because of how fast we operate.
Mm,
And then, as you mentioned, another reason is the threat actors have also evolved with the technologies.
mm,
Like right now, there are like a lot more sophisticated attacks against these distributed systems,
right.
with more
Yes.
and more complex systems that leverage a lot of new and emerging technologies coming up. Attackers have evolved as well. People, yeah, they're like, as you mentioned, state-sponsored actors, and right now that's things are just getting worse in the world, and
Absolutely.
people want to make sure that they leverage this. Technology has become like the backbone of a lot of our transactions these days. Be it
Correct.
physical or digital or whatever it is. Like our world thrives on technology.
Mm,
So disrupting this might be like the biggest win for an attacker, and hence it's just going to get important as we progress.
right. Right. And these supply chain breaches, they aren't actually just limited to data breaches, right? I think they are now going beyond just data breaches with multiple other types of strains that we see being leveraged by threat actors. And Akash, since you must have actually had some real life experience of certain incidents that might have potentially impacted supply chain infrastructures, can you share maybe a lesser known or an actual example of a supply chain attack that impacted, let's say, a physical infrastructure or safety? The idea is that I want to highlight the broader potential consequences of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of you might be aware of the Solarwinds hack that happened in late
Yes.
2020. That's like
Mm,
the most famous and probably the most disruptive software supply chain attack.
mm-hmm.
So that was when, uh, FireEye, a cybersecurity firm, identified that one of their users had this random device that enrolled into their MFA systems.
Yeah.
So they detected it and kind of traced back. It went to this Orion software from SolarWinds that was
Mm,
compromised. And it was later discovered that, attackers had done it like a few years prior to that.
yes.
It was an advanced persistent threat and all that.
Mm,
So that's an incident that actually got me thinking into, this domain and how essential it is to make things secure.
mm,
So I'll come back to this part later, but to quote a few examples of where I had to personally, work on software supply chain issues.
mm-hmm.
This was again, I think, in late 2021. That was when we had this vulnerability on the Log4j Java
Yes.
package.
Apache.
That was, yeah, Apache
Yes.
Log4j. So that was like back when I was a software engineer, and
Mm,
our products were actually using Log4j as like a core component to make things work.
of course.
So yeah, this Zeroday vulnerability had a CBSS score of 10, which is like the highest score. And that was like a really critical moment for us to make sure that we patched it and get it
Yes.
out as soon as possible. Because like people were coming with exploit scripts that just required a click to run.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think
I've built one.
yeah, I remember even you had published one. So we had to act quickly, and we had
Yes.
to make sure that we got these packages patched and all that. And a lot of interesting observations were made in that process because as you might be aware, like the supply chain dependency is like a huge tree. As
Hmm.
you inherit a as you inherit a dependency, there's like a lot more dependencies to that one. And this just keeps on growing.
Correct.
So when you want to patch something, I think a lot of complexities emerge from that pattern, because you might suddenly be presented with a package that one of your other dependencies isn't compatible with, and the entire chain just breaks down.
Hmm.
So it was not as simple as just updating the version number and making sure everything
Yes.
worked, because there was some
Correct.
tight dependency between our older versions.
Yeah, and
So
and the version number update actually did not work because that was the very first fix for Log4j, that was to update the version. And in a matter of few hours, when we suggested this recommendation, Log4j vulnerability started affecting the newer versions as well. So the
oh yeah,
patch update was not a. It was a terrible day for security.
yeah, I mean absolutely, and making sure that the engineers actually understood this, and we got our codes checked in.
Yep.
That was like an interesting phase where I had to like deal the consequence of such an attack. Another incident that I'd like to quote is what happened with the pwnkit or the pwnkit package on Linux systems. So I
Okay.
think this was in 2022.
Okay.
There was this package on every Linux system that included
Hmm.
enterprise distributions and also personal distributions.
This was default installed in the Linux systems.
Yes, the
Okay.
pwnkit package allowed Linux systems to do privilege escalation. So, I mean, privilege escalation, while it might seem like a dangerous thing, that's like a core functionality of an operating system.
Of course. Yes.
And the I think it stood for PolicyKit. I'm not sure what the full form was, but that was like the package on Linux responsible to manage these privilege escalations.
Hmm.
So there was like a vulnerability on that package, and suddenly all your Linux systems that practically run the web were vulnerable.
Hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, I was actually like a SOC analyst uh, when this happened. So I had to
Okay.
make sure that our systems did not receive any malicious strings that could exploit this vulnerability. We
Right.
had a team of sysadmins making sure that our Linux systems were patched. Again, we had accumulated a lot of tech debt until that point. So
Yes.
to make sure that this was patched was not as simple as just doing an update.
Hmm. Hmm.
I think I'll come to the complexities of this when we discuss the technical implications of security. But yeah, these were like a few instances where I had to deal with
Wow.
the
Wow. And Log4j was, I think, a story for everyone, right? In fact,
yeah.
we stopped whatever we were doing on that day, and I remember the day specifically because we called the day Log4j Day, right? And the whole idea was to be able to prioritize where Log4j lies, and that's where the information security concepts like asset inventory management really plays a critical role, right? Because on those days is when we truly understood that, hey, if we didn't have the inventory that we are having today, how would we ever go around firstly discovering where Log4j is in our entire ecosystem,
Absolutely, yeah.
right? And secondly, I don't think a lot of the professional tools actually released the scripts to test whether or not Log4j vulnerability was still vulnerable in our systems. So at least in our organization at the time, we had to write custom scripts, try certain WAF bypasses as well, because it was a fairly new payload as well, right? And it was a very simple one, in fact, the JNDI
Yeah,
string. So it was a very chaotic day, but I wouldn't say a day to remember, a day I would not want to remember, but unfortunately, I'm always going to have the memory of.
yeah, that's true. I mean, these are like kind of inevitable looking at how complex things are getting.
Yep, yep,
So, yeah, I think being prepared for them is probably the best way to go.
correct. Yes. So Akash, these kind of vulnerabilities that threat actors always leverage in their attack vectors, they're not always about financial gain. At least that's what I've seen, right? And it goes beyond traditional cybercrime motives. Uh, so while there are some emerging trends in terms of motivations for supply chain attacks specifically, do you see any other motives that are coming at a wider scale apart from financial gain, such as maybe, let's say, espionage or intellectual property theft?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the most interesting thing with supply chains and attacks on them is they're just a means to get to something. When you like
Hmm.
attack or compromise a part of the supply chain, it's not that specific
Hmm.
tool or process that you want to compromise. It's rather what is in the downstream.
Right.
Uh, so that's like an interesting reason why these matter a lot. And
Hmm.
as you mentioned, it's not just to make harm or infiltrate data and take things out, but um, because of how software is presently running everywhere and practically like the backbone of everything today,
Hmm.
attacks on this have been targeted on governments. Like, for
Hmm.
example, one of the primary reasons why the SolarWind attack even unfolded was because on their website, SolarWinds had publicized that every branch of the U.S. military had actually been using the Orion software, and
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
it actually turned out that while the threat actors were designing this malicious payload update,
Hmm.
they kind of leveraged a compromised password from an intern in one of the security agencies and all that. So
Hmm.
yeah, it was kind of determined that the primary motive of the SolarWinds attack was actually for cyber espionage. Uh,
Okay. Okay.
so yeah, I mean that's not like the primary thing. That's the complexity
Hmm.
because of how wide the blast radius can be.
Right.
People just throw a net out there and wait for any fish to get caught.
Get stuck.
And
Yes.
yeah,
Absolutely.
so there's absolutely no exception to who isn't vulnerable to a supply chain attack. So
Hmm.
yeah, I personally have not like read case studies about how this is being leveraged on a broader scale, but I'm pretty sure that this is being used to target every kind of individual and governments alike.
Right, right. And one of the things that you said very interestingly is that softwares, of course, are going to be the core components of any of the processes, right? You talk about financial processes, logistical processes. Software component is definitely going to be there, but what I've started to observe these days is that supply chain attack is as a surface itself is going beyond software, and this is of course with the advent of Internet of Things devices coming into play and how they are interconnected with the supply chain processes. And due to this, do you see any challenges being present that are newly upcoming because let's say IoT is starting to get integrated into supply chain processes?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are supply chains involved in both IoT and OT systems. So, with a physical device in your hand that runs a software, there's another layer of complexity that you add because, in
Hmm.
addition to securing the software that runs on that end device, we'll also
Hmm.
have to ensure that the hardware is also secure because IoT hardware is it's like a highly localized end node,
Hmm.
and it's kind of easy to make compromise the device that your code runs on.
Right.
So yeah, I think there's been like attacks on the Google Nest, the
Yes. Yes.
temperature control hub, and I think and a lot more examples, I'm sure.
Hmm.
So yeah, you'd have to make sure that the over-the-air updates that you get to your IoT devices are secure. All the dependencies that it inherits are secure.
Hmm.
The device that is shipped out to the customers are intact. You'll have to make sure that it's resistant against physical tampering because in a lot
Hmm.
of cases it could be as simple as rewiring your device and causing havoc.
Right.
So yeah, there's like a lot of stages that you'll have to verify, and IoT and OT will just add another layer of complexity.
Hmm.
There's been a lot of recommendations around how these devices are leveraged in an industrial setting because suddenly there's this notion of critical infrastructure that you'll have to protect.
Huh.
So with our electric distribution grids, you know nuclear processing facilities and a lot of that. When processes are being digitized, there's a lot more things in stake.
Hmm.
Because suddenly, a cyber attack does not just mean a disruption of your digital service, but rather something that's physical and tangible.
Correct.
So, yeah, if you could, hack your way into a dam and mess up with its actuators, it could
Yeah.
actually cause
Yeah.
real
And
life.
we all know about the Iranian power grid as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure there's like tons of such attacks happening every single day, and people are working hard to defend it.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think people are resorting to air gapping these IoT systems,
Correct.
making sure that
Yes.
any new piece of code that you get into the system is vetted thoroughly and all that.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
it's good that you're going in that direction, because at a later point of this podcast, I have a rapid fire round for you, and one of the questions is coming to you regarding how air gapping is impactful.
oh,
Uh,
okay, yeah.
but Akash, something that you said really struck me, and it is spot on, right? That a lot of the time, supply chain attacks are initial access techniques in the entire threat attack vector.
Mhm.
Personally, as a red teamer as well, right? When we are trying to compromise the organization, some of the initial access techniques we tend to use are phishing, technology exploits, etc. But I can vouch for that. Supply chain attacks has always had the highest success rate in delivering that initial foothold into
Mhm.
a company's network,
Yeah.
and thus then we can pull it up to get our privileged access, go on steroids and get more domain controller level access at a later point. So yeah, you're spot on the fact that supply chain attacks are generally one of the best ways that attackers leverage in order to establish their initial foothold into the systems. Lovely. Uh, you know, we've discussed what supply chain attacks look for, uh, or look like for the organizations. But what is the solution to this? Because let's say I, as an entity, would want to partner with certain suppliers. Now, from a security standpoint, of course, firstly, security is not going to be my key concern, because functionality always precedes security, unfortunately.
Yeah.
However, let's assume I am a very security focused entity, right? And I want to partner with vendor ABC.
Mhm.
Uh, of course, one of the things is that I will look at their security audits. I will ask for their certifications, ISO, blah, blah, blah. But going beyond traditional security audits, Akash, are there any innovative approaches you think organizations can use to assess the security posture of their vendors, or their suppliers, such as maybe pen testing their
Mhm.
production lines or leveraging blockchain technology, for example?
Yeah, I mean, this is an amazing question. So, as you rightly mentioned, like there's been a industry-wide focus on shifting security left, but there's only
Yes,
so far that you can go because functionality has to exist.
of course, of course.
So, yeah, I think making sure that you're resilient and you are able to defend these supply chain attacks on a proactive basis is quite essential.
Hmm.
There's like a lot of guidelines. There's like guidelines from NIST. There are like guidelines from companies. Like for example, Google has something called SLSA,
Yes,
SLSA,
yes,
and
correct.
then Microsoft has got S2C2, something of that sort. So all these organizations have come up with their own standards, and there's a lot of ways to interpret them. But the
Okay.
way I think, on a high level, what people should be doing is to be cognizant of, what are the touch points,
Hmm.
how things interact with each other, and make sure that you draw your threat boundaries every time there's like a dependency established.
Okay.
So a common approach has been to list all the dependencies in a software bill of materials,
Mm-hmm.
or SBOM. So
Yes.
that you list all your assets, you create this inventory of all the dependencies that you've inherited, and you can then get deep into each of them and audit that separately. So
Okay.
just being cognizant of everything that powers your processes. That's important.
Hmm.
And then also, when you want to work with external vendors and all of them, uh, it's often advantageous to leverage the zero trust mindset to make
Right.
sure that every single thing from people, process, everything
Hmm.
is like verified twice, and you know just follow your cybersecurity best practices, like principle of least privilege, making sure that every systems that you run is like secure,
Hmm.
establish your network perimeters and boundaries
The
appropriately.
foundations.
Yeah, the foundations, making sure
Yes.
your foundations are in place for every step of this supply chain, because it's not like one specific part that's vulnerable. This
Right.
really is this process that spans across your entire
Hmm.
company. So yeah, I'd
Right.
say make sure your fundamentals are in place. Be double cautious, stay proactive, and then yeah, just take a agile approach to securing things.
Okay, brilliant. I think these are very good points, Akash. Zero trust being a very big one, and how we can stick to the foundations, as you rightly said, because things are always going to evolve at a pace that security may or may not adapt to. But as a backup or as a layer of defense that we can always probably be reliant upon to a certain level is going to be those foundations that we build around access management, around our defense in depth, around zero trust, around network layers, right? So
Totally.
spot on. Okay. So Akash, thank you for some of the insights that you've provided, and we've had a lovely discussion. But I want to take this as a segue for us to break into a rapid fire questions round. And before the podcast, we have prepared a few questions, and it's mostly A or B. Now, Akash, one of the things is that I have deliberately put the questions in A or B format in a way that both A and B are going to be sensible, or there are always going to be people who will always feel that B is definitely right or A is always right. So there is no one answer, but
Mhm.
this is all about just understanding that in this point in time,
Mhm.
uh, what you would want to pick and prioritize, and just get 2 cents of your insights into this.
Yeah,
Lovely.
totally.
Can we get started?
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Awesome. Okay. So, Akash, question number one is focusing on industry specific security standards like IEC 62443 for industrial control systems, or adopting a zero trust security model for all supply chain interactions.
I'd say adopting a zero trust model for all interactions, because, okay, it's a rapid fire. I don't want to justify things.
No, please do. Please do. I
Okay.
don't want to just
So
know
I
A or B.
first, industry specific things is like you'll first have to identify which industry that you exactly fall into, and in a lot of real world cases,
Uh-huh.
that kind of becomes fuzzy, because you wouldn't strictly adhere to just one definition of an industry. So I'd say taking a more holistic approach might be
Makes
advantageous,
sense.
and then you could get specific.
Makes sense. Okay. Okay. Brilliant. Question number two is utilizing endpoint detection and response EDR solutions across the entire supply chain network, or employing network segmentation strategies to isolate critical infrastructure, and why?
Okay, I mean, for this, I think it's absolutely option B. That is to, employ segmentation, because you don't essentially own all parts of your supply chain. So there's
Right.
like only so much that you can do. So
Hmm.
segment it, make sure that the parts that you own have like the best EDR, XDR, and whatnot.
Hmm.
But then for the parts that you don't own, segmentation is like the way to go.
Okay. Brilliant. Question number three is enforcing software bill of materials or SBOM requirements for all suppliers, or implementing secure coding practices and training for developers within the supply chain.
Okay, I think, I mean, as much as I want to make sure that everyone is following the best coding practices,
Hmm.
again, you don't own all parts of your supply chain. So I
Right.
think creating an SBOM and your developers would obviously have to make sure that they follow the best coding practices. But for all the external dependencies, creating an SBOM and then auditing each of them is the
Right.
only practical solution. As much as I want everyone to
Makes
code
sense. Yes.
beautifully.
And you are absolutely right. In practical experience, also when we speak, we might want to do the training of all developers within the supply chain, but as a theory, it sounds good, but in practicality, it is definitely an overkill.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Question number 4 is: would you prefer conducting regular tabletop or simulation exercises to simulate, say, supply chain security incidents and gauge the response? Or would you be investing in threat intelligence subscriptions to stay updated on the latest attack vectors?
Okay. So I'd say, for any process that you have conducting, tabletop, these chaos-inducing exercises are pretty essential.
Mm-hmm.
And supply chain is no different.
Okay.
But I think the latter part, making sure your threat intelligence is up to date and is embedded in your processes, that's
Mm.
imperative.
Okay.
So even when you do these tabletop exercises, the participants will have to make sure that they are up to date on what are the attack vectors applicable to their systems.
That's a very diplomatic answer, Akash. I've still not got an A or B in this one.
Okay, if you're just talking about paying subscriptions and using that as a set it forget it model, I'd say being proactive is more important.
Okay.
There's no
Okay.
set it and forget approach to supply chain security.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. All right. My last question on this round is uh, focusing on air gap networks for critical infrastructure within the supply chain, or prioritizing continuous integration and continuous delivery CI/CD pipelines within the built-in security checks. So air gapping or prioritizing CI/CD built-in security.
Okay, when we're talking about infrastructures, I think when you meet a set of requirements and things work, you don't have to
Hmm.
change it unless you have a new requirement. So I'd say air gapping. My answer
Hmm.
is going to be different if it's like for consumer-facing apps.
Mm-hmm.
You obviously cannot air gap your solution in that case, but for critical infrastructure, I think air gapping is probably the best strategy.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. Brilliant. So that brings us to the end of the rapid fire round, Akash. I just want to ask one thing that I probably missed out, which was that if you could invent one new security control specifically for supply chains, what would it be?
I'd say, with the advancements in AI that's happening today and,
Mm-hmm.
all the amazing stuff that is happening with LLMs and all that, I'd probably look into, securing some aspect of that because, now you have this new, um, your supply chain is not just when you base your decision making process on non-deterministic systems like LLMs and stuff like that.
Mm.
Supply chain attacks could not, like they might not necessarily emerge from an external source, but could rather be a result of internal manipulation in some cases.
Right.
So I'd say putting some checks and balances on how decision making processes work on top of non-deterministic systems is where I'd be focusing on.
Okay, okay, brilliant. But Akash, I also wanted to understand in this entire supply chain, there are a lot of processes involved. Okay, let's say if you could hack into any one of the systems in the entire supply chain, of course, ethically, what system would be the most informative for understanding vulnerabilities? For example, if we say bank, right, the system that would absolutely be a no-go, or the highest amount of investments from security measures would be made, would be the core banking system network of the bank's infrastructure. So from a supply chain perspective, is there any specific system or a network that is extremely informative and a definite no-go for hackers to be able to penetrate into?
I mean, absolutely. Anything on your DMZ,
Hmm.
that has to be protected with utmost priority because that's like facing the external world.
Of course.
And more often than not, these are the systems that let attackers gain a foothold into your corporate network.
Hmm.
So securing them is like absolutely important, and making sure all your Bastion servers, anything that you set up for your corporate VPN access. These are
Hmm.
like things that are super critical. So yeah, I'd say protecting them should be like a top priority.
Okay, so every external asset and every intermediate jump servers that might be facing the public internet, which can potentially allow an internal access, those would be your focus points if it had to, come to picking the most important thing to protect.
Yeah, from a systems perspective, but now that you reiterated, I'm also thinking if I should start with the employees, making sure
Hmm.
that their edge devices are all protected. But yeah, uh,
Right.
I mean, both
So,
of these are important. So just
it is
priorities.
two streets, right? It is apples and oranges completely. When you say the first part, which is your DMZ and all those assets, that's completely about external security, and then you also focus on the internal security pillar, wherein your employee endpoints will come into play. Fair enough. So it needs equal prioritization.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Brilliant. Uh, Thanks, Akash, for doing this. I think this is a brilliant episode and a lot of insights that I've also personally obtained on supply chain security's landscape. Nevertheless, someone who's doing this day in, day out and has seen certain security incidents happen, right? So, thank you so much for doing this, firstly.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's been my pleasure, discussing this with you on a lovely morning. So yeah, looking forward to more such, sessions where we both learn from each other.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So, friends, that is it for this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in to that One Sec Guys podcast episode. And if you want more such industry experts bringing in their insights from their sectors, please do consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. And as always, stay safe and stay curious. Thank you.
Thank you.